He couldn't walk. At least that's what the legends say. And yet he conquered England, Ireland, and Scotland. He commanded armies that shook the foundations of kingdoms. He executed kings in rituals so brutal that historians still argue about whether they actually happened. And when he died, Irish chroniclers, men who had every reason to hate him, called him the king of all the Norsemen of Ireland and Britain. His name was Ivar the Boneless, and he might be the most terrifying Viking who ever lived. By the end of this, you will understand what boneless actually means, why nobody can fully agree on the answer, how a man who may have been carried into battle on a shield or a stretcher built an empire stretching across the British Isles, and what he did to a king called Ella that made his name synonymous with vengeance for the next 1,000 years. Nobody knows exactly when Ivar was born. Historians place it somewhere between 794 and 830 AD, probably in Denmark or Sweden. He is claimed in the sagas as the son of the legendary Viking king Ragnar Lodbrok and his wife Aslaug, a woman said to possess prophetic powers and knowledge of dark Norse magic. Ragnar himself is semi-legendary, a figure who straddles the line between history and myth, so the family connection might be exaggerated for prestige, or Ivar might have been adopted into the lineage, which was a common Viking practice. But whether the blood connection was literal or political, the name carried weight. To be a son of Ragnar Lodbrok in the Viking world was to carry a reputation before you had even done anything to earn it. And then there was the nickname, the Boneless, Ivar hin Beinlausi in Old Norse. Historians have been arguing about what it means for centuries and still have not settled on an answer. The most dramatic theory is that Ivar suffered from a genetic condition, possibly osteogenesis imperfecta, brittle bone disease, that made his bones fragile or cartilage-like, leaving him unable to walk and requiring his men to carry him into battle on a shield or a stretcher. This theory has real weight behind it. Multiple sources describe him being carried. And the skeleton discovered at Repton in England, buried in what was the Viking winter camp of 873 to 874, shows a tall male figure, nearly 6 feet, exceptional for the era, with significant battle wounds and pagan burial artifacts, and bones that show signs of a congenital condition. Many historians believe that skeleton is Ivar. Nobody can prove it yet. Other theories suggest the name was a euphemism, boneless as a reference to impotence or a lack of virility in the sexual sense, which would have been a devastating insult in Norse culture and might explain why he channeled everything into conquest and dominance. Others still say the name referred to extreme physical flexibility, allowing him to contort in ways that made him lethal in close combat. And the sagas offer their own explanation, that Ragnar ignored Aslaug's warning to wait 3 nights before consummating their marriage, and Ivar was born as a consequence of that impatience, cursed from his first breath to live without the use of his legs. What all of the theories agree on is this: whatever the nickname meant, it didn't slow him down. Ivar turned whatever weakness he carried into something else entirely. He became, according to the chronicles, the most cruel of all the Viking leaders of his age. Not the strongest, not the fastest, the most cruel and the most clever. Those two things together made him something that kingdoms found impossible to stop. He had brothers who raided alongside him: Björn Ironside, Halfdan Ragnarsson, Sigurd Snake in the Eye, Vitsirk, and Ubba. Together they formed a Viking dynasty of extraordinary violence and reach. But it was Ivar who most consistently preferred conquest and settlement over hit-and-run raiding. Where other Vikings took what they could carry and left, Ivar wanted to rule. He was thinking in generations, not seasons. In 853 AD, Ivar arrived in Ireland with a massive fleet, partnering with a Viking leader called Olaf the White. Together they overwhelmed local Viking factions and Irish kings, collecting tribute, taking hostages, establishing dominance. Ivar began building his power base in Dublin, transforming it from a raided settlement into something that would eventually become one of the most important Viking cities in the world. This was the moment that separated Ivar from most of his contemporaries. He wasn't just raiding Ireland, he was intending to own it. But the moment that defined Ivar forever came from a story about his father. The saga account says that Ragnar Lodbrok, attempting a raid into Northumbria with too small a force, was captured by King Aelle and executed by being thrown into a pit of snakes. As he died, Ragnar is supposed to have called out a prophecy, how the little pigs would grunt if they knew how the old boar suffered. The little pigs were his sons, and when word reached them that their father had been murdered in a snake pit, they made a decision. In 865 AD, Ivar Halfdan and Ubba assembled what the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle called the Great Heathen Army and landed in East Anglia. This was not a raiding party. This was not a force looking for silver and cattle. This was an organized conquest machine, an army built specifically to bring kingdoms to their knees and hold them there. The East Anglian king, terrified, provided them with horses and supplies in exchange for peace. Ivar accepted. He needed the horses for what came next. The army moved north in 866 AD. On November 1st, All Saints' Day, while the population of York was occupied with religious observance, the Great Heathen Army struck. They seized the city of York, the capital of Northumbria, in a single devastating assault. The Northumbrians rallied and counterattacked months later, attempting to retake their capital. They were slaughtered. And in the aftermath of that defeat, Ivar captured the man he had come specifically to find, King Ivar of Northumbria. What happened next is one of the most debated events in Viking history. The sagas describe the Blood Eagle, a ritual execution so extreme that even historians who study Viking violence regularly cannot agree on whether it actually took place or whether it was a later invention designed to make Vikings seem maximally terrifying. According to the accounts, the victim was restrained face down while their ribs were cut from the spine, the lungs pulled out through the back and spread like wings. The entire point was suffering. The entire point was that the men doing this wanted the man dying beneath their hands to understand, in his final moments of consciousness, that this was not random. This was specific. This was Ragnar's sons, collecting what they were owed. Whether the Blood Eagle ritual was historical fact or saga embellishment, the execution of Ivar was real. Ivar had his revenge. And then, because revenge was not the point, conquest was the point, he installed a puppet king named Egbert to rule Northumbria under Viking authority and turned his attention to the next target. Between 867 and 868 AD, the Great Heathen Army ravaged Mercia, forcing King Birgerd to pay tribute rather than face the same fate as Northumbria. Ivar used York as a strategic base, positioning the Viking force in the center of England and using it to pressure kingdoms from multiple directions simultaneously. This was not Viking raiding. This was geopolitics. This was a man who understood that the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were vulnerable to division and who exploited that vulnerability with the patience and calculation of a chess player rather than the fury of a berserker. Though to be clear, he was also a berserker. Sources describe Ivar entering trance-like states of rage and battle, fighting with a ferocity that seemed to exist outside normal human limits, despite whatever physical condition he carried. The contradiction at the heart of Ivar the Boneless is exactly this. A man who may have been unable to walk under his own power, carried onto battlefields by his warriors, who then fought with the terrifying violence of someone who had nothing to prove and everything to take. His brains made him unstoppable strategically. His rage made him unstoppable personally. In 869 to 870 AD, Ivar's forces turned south and overran East Anglia. They captured King Edmund, the Anglo-Saxon Christian king, who had given them horses and peace just a few years earlier. Edmund refused to renounce his faith or share his kingdom on Viking terms. The legends say Ivar's men tied him to a tree, shot him full of arrows in the manner of the martyred Saint Sebastian, and then beheaded him. Edmund was later canonized, Saint Edmund, martyr and king. The town of Bury St. Edmunds takes its name from his burial place. The man who created a saint by killing a king is a piece of history that tends to get left out of the story. In 870 AD, partnering again with Olaf the White, Ivar turned north to Scotland. The fortress of Dumbarton, the rock stronghold of the kingdom of Strathclyde, sat on a volcanic plug rising from the Clyde, one of the most defensible positions in the British Isles. Ivar and Olaf besieged it for 4 months. Where direct assault would have been suicidal, Ivar chose patience. He cut off the water supplies. He waited. After 4 months of slow strangulation, the fortress surrendered. The Vikings looted it comprehensively and took hundreds of prisoners back to Dublin as slaves. This was Ivar's genius on full display. He could fight in a berserker rage when necessary. He could also simply wait. He had the discipline to run a 4-month siege, the logistics to sustain an army in the field for that long, and the strategic vision to understand that patience was sometimes the most violent weapon available. In 871 AD, Ivar returned to Dublin loaded with the wealth of a campaign that had stretched across England and Scotland. He ruled there as the Irish annals record him. King of the Norsemen of all Ireland and Britain, he had founded a Viking dynasty. Dublin under his rule became a major hub of the Norse slave trade, funneling the human cost of conquest into economic power that would sustain his descendants for generations. His family would go on to control Dublin, Northumbria, and the Isle of Man for centuries. His invasions so weakened the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of England that they never fully recovered their pre-Viking political landscape, paving the way for later Viking kings like Canute the Great. In 873 AD, Ivar died in Dublin. The cause is uncertain. Irish annals record a sudden and horrible disease that might be connected to whatever condition had given him his nickname. Or, other sources suggest, he died peacefully. A Viking warlord in his bed, which for a man of his career was almost more remarkable than any battle death. He was recorded at his death by people who had every reason to remember him with hatred, as the king of all the Norsemen of Ireland and Britain. Whether the skeleton at Repton is his, the tall, disabled man buried with pagan honor among the Viking dead, nobody can say with certainty. Some scholars suggest his burial was a ship grave in Cumbria instead. The body of Ivar the Boneless is as elusive as the man himself. What is not elusive is his legacy. He reshaped the British Isles. He created the conditions that would define England's political history for the next 2 centuries. He built a Viking empire from a shield, if the stories are true, directing armies from the position of a man who could not stand among them. The TV show Vikings and its successor give you a version of him, the cunning psychopath, physically disabled, intellectually untouchable. The fiction captures something real. The real Ivar was a man whom the world gave every reason to be diminished and who chose instead to be legendary. He took a potential weakness and turned it into a symbol so powerful that 12 centuries later, people are still saying his name, Ivar the Boneless, king of all the Norsemen of Ireland and Britain, the most cruel, the most clever, and perhaps, if you look at what he actually built, the most consequential Viking who ever lived.